The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. A group of distinguished economists, including more than 24 Nobel Prize winners and more than a dozen former chairs of the Federal Reserve or the Council of Economic Advisors, recently released a statement in support of a carbon tax to address human-caused global warming. What are the economic elements of a carbon tax, and why does it make sense as a way to address global warming? Is it possible that the revenues of the tax could be refunded to American families, making the tax revenue neutral, and yet still effective? How does the economic analysis depend on uncertainties in climate models? And is there perhaps a political economy rationale to be skeptical of the carbon tax as a wise policy for America? Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about these questions is my colleague, Dr. John Duff, the Manuel Johnson Professor of Economics with the Johnson Center. Although today, John, welcome back. Today we're going to be mixing things up and you're going to be asking me the questions, right?
That's right. Thanks a lot, Dan.
So let's get right to it.
That sounds good. Yeah, so I think the place to start is to, just kind of talk about what exactly is a carbon tax, and then, how does that relate to climate change specifically?
Well, climate change is driven by greenhouse gases building up in the atmosphere. And although there is a variety of different greenhouse gases, the most significant one is carbon dioxide. And the largest source of human-caused additions to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would be the burning of fossil fuels. Although I might mention that virtually every action that humans would undertake would affect the carbon balance in the atmosphere to some extent. Methane's a greenhouse gas, and so raising cattle, for instance, is going to affect methane releases, and planting trees or shrubs would affect the carbon balance. So at one level, almost everything that we could do is going to be relevant for climate change or global warming. But what it primarily comes down to is probably the use of fossil fuels in all of the different fashions, both the oil, electricity if it's generated from natural gas or coal, and whether we're burning gas in cars or in industry.
So what are some current policies that are in place meant to combat climate change?
We've got a number of different regulations and also then a number of different subsidies or mandates to encourage renewable fuels or low carbon or clean different types of fuels. Probably the most prominent regulations that have been taken to address climate change would be the Clean Power Plan that was adopted for power plants in the United States, both in two sets of that, one for new power plants and then one for existing power plants. And then there was also the fuel economy standards for cars and light trucks that were going to be raised significantly, although the Trump administration has put a halt on those. So then there are a number of other environmental regulations that would have some relevance. And then a number of states have policies in place as well. In addition, there's also a number of policies that we have trying to encourage the use of renewable or particularly clean or green forms of fuels, whether it be wind power, electric cars, solar power, even like biofuels that they can mix with gasoline to power cars. So we have a variety of different programs across the spectrum.
Well, given that, then does a tax actually make sense as a method and means to go about trying to combat and control pollution?
Probably, because economists have really come to think about the problem of pollution as one of being some spillover costs. That when we undertake actions, normally in our actions that in the market, we have to purchase all the inputs that we're going to use to produce the goods or services. But when we think about pollution, and this was a way of thinking that's gone back to economists like A.C. Pigou and Ronald Coase, sometimes it's as if we're able to use some inputs, and you could think of, like, say, using clean air. When a car drives down the road and puts exhaust into the atmosphere, it's polluting the air. Another way of thinking that is as if it's like using some clean air, using up some clean air in the process of driving. And we know that to build a car, the auto company has to pay for the steel, and the rubber for the tires, and the plastic, and the paint, and the workers that they use to make the car. And oil companies have to pay for the petroleum, and then to refine it, and for the gas stations, for the gas that goes into the car. And drivers have to pay for all of these things, but nobody has to pay for the clean air. And because we have an unpriced resource that people get to use, we end up using too much of it. So in other words, from an economist standpoint, we think of, we use the term externality, but we're able to impose some costs on others or on the environment without having to pay for it. So it's really a matter of prices not being correct.
So it looks like then a tax could be fairly effective at something like this. If that's the case, then why would we ever use regulation?
Well, if we can use when we can use a price or a tax, that would make a lot of sense. One question and a big limiting factor in using taxes to correct for externalities, whether we can actually tax the externality itself or not. Sometimes we can't tax something at all, and if we can't measure and then for tax something, then we might have to rely on command and control regulations. So we couldn't measure the amount of emissions coming out of a car's tailpipe, so we had to say to automakers, you will install this technology to reduce emissions coming out of cars. So if you can't measure pollution directly, then you can't tax or price it. If we can do that, then the best thing to do would be to try to, and this was Pigou's idea almost a century ago, so he's way ahead of his time in this regard, to think that put a tax on to reflect the costs that would be spilling over that you wouldn't be having to pay for directly, and then let the prices adjust because you would be putting a tax on something, and so the price would have to rise to cover the amount of the taxes as well as the other inputs that we're using. But then you could use the decentralized coordination that we see with prices every day. So, you know, in deciding whether to drive or bike to work, we can all look at the price of cars, we look at the price of gasoline, we look at the price of bicycles, and you know what the weather is like, and our personal level of fitness, and make a decision there. Well, since we were not thinking about the damage we were doing to the environment, once we adjust the price properly, we can just rely on people to make the decisions that are in their own best interest, and then also going to protect the environment as well.
So are there any other economic advantages then that would come from taxation over regulation?
Well, one of the problems that we see in regulation is that when you try to do things through command and control, you end up sort of legally or administratively often having to treat different sources of pollution equally. So you end up, you have to have largely uniform rules to affect things. And one of the consequences is that many times you can't tailor regulation very carefully to make sure to take advantage of differences in say cost of reducing pollution across plants. So if you imagine you had two electric power plants, and one of them could reduce emissions, and we want them both to reduce emissions of pollutant by say 20% on average. But one could reduce emissions quite easily, and so they could possibly reduce pollution very easily 30% or 40%, and the other would have a hard time doing anything to reduce pollutants without incurring huge costs. So we might want to have like one plant reduce their pollution 30% and one reduce it 10%. But that's really hard to do through regulation because in effect the EPA or some regulator would be saying to one plant, you have to do more than this plant has to do. And the plant that has to do more can legally challenge that and say, on what basis are you saying that we have to do more? And so it becomes very difficult. Economically, we need to treat different sources of pollution with different costs differently. But through the regulatory process, it's very hard to do that. If you have a price on carbon, for instance, or a price on pollutant, then that factory that could reduce at low cost will do more so because it's cheaper for them to reduce their pollution than to have to pay the tax. Whereas the factory that couldn't do very much to reduce the power plant that couldn't do very much to reduce their pollution won't do very much because they'll find it cheaper to pay the tax. But we allow the decentralization to maintain itself.
And so, thinking about then renewables, we hear about the importance of renewables like solar and wind power, but that also many of these renewable energy sources receive significant subsidies. The argument being that this is a way to kind of level the playing field with fossil fuels. So could we possibly then use some form of a carbon tax to maybe level that playing field out?
It really should, because if we put a carbon tax on, and economists show that the carbon tax, the economic analysis shows that the carbon tax should be rising over time, but in a predictable fashion. That rising carbon tax, by pushing up the prices of fossil fuels, so automatically we're going to see that, okay, gasoline is, say, going to become more expensive. So that, and predictably so. So that should give people an incentive to invest to the extent that they can in electric cars or invest in solar power as opposed to, say, coal or other fossil fuels that are going to become more expensive over time. So in theory, the carbon tax also then should be the incentive, should create the incentive by adjusting fossil fuels prices that would be necessary to motivate research and deployment of low carbon forms of energy. So the economist proposal really recommends implementing this carbon tax and walking back or taking back all the other regulations and subsidies that we're doing to affect climate change. We'll replace a whole range of different policies with one broad-based carbon tax.
Yeah, and so obviously you talked about recently there are a number of Nobel laureates and other economists that have argued for a carbon tax, but this isn't really new, especially as far as federal policy proposals go. Back in, I think, 2010, there was the cap and trade proposal before Congress. How would this, or how did this relate to a carbon tax?
They're both relatively similar. There are some differences, but that's a pretty advanced issue in economics to get into the differences. But they're both very similar in that they can maintain a large amount of decentralized reaction. Let different sources of pollution react based on what they see as their own costs of compliance. And that's an advantage over any kind of a regulatory approach. So there's largely some similarities.
And so, another question, we talk about the importance of price signals and everything else with the tax, but I think that one important consideration is, where do you actually set the tax at? And then, what effect would this actually have on consumers?
Well, different economic models are used to try to assess this. The tax, at least based on these economic models, would begin somewhere in the range of $25 to $50 per ton of carbon, which would translate into, for instance, with gasoline, a $25 per ton tax on carbon would approximately be about 25 cents a gallon in gas tax. And like I mentioned, this would be scheduled to rise over time, because over time what we want to do is incentives to continue to shift away from using fossil fuels to the extent that we can.
So what would happen to this revenue that was actually generated then from a carbon tax?
Well, there are different things we could do. One thing is that if we did use it to fund, to replace some other types of taxes that the government currently raises, this could end up being a good thing for our economy, because if we're taxing things like, say, income or investment, well, income and investment are the kinds of things that help grow our economy, help produce beneficial economic activity. There's an old saying in economics: if we tax anything, you get less of it. And so if you're raising revenue by taxing something like income or investment, you'll get less of that, and that'll make the economy poorer. If you tax pollution, well, you get less pollution, but that's a good thing. So instead of having taxes that impose an extra cost, an excess burden, to use the economist term, on the economy beyond the revenue that you raise, you could use a tax that's actually helping to correct an externality, and we wouldn't have that excess burden on top of it.
Oh, interesting. Is there anything else that we could do with that tax revenue?
Well, the economists, so a distinguished group of economists, in their proposal actually recommend refunding the money to to American households, equal basis across households. So all the revenue that we collected, we funded equally across households. And this is, I think, is a wise element of the policy, because we know that low-income households spend a larger share of their budget, of their income every month on energy, whether it be gasoline to drive their cars, or heat to heat their houses, or for air conditioning. Low-income households spend a larger share of their income than higher income families on energy. So they would pay a higher share. If you think of a carbon tax as really an energy tax, low-income families would be paying a larger share of their income in taxes. So the tax would be what's known as a regressive tax, falling heavily on low-income families. By refunding the revenue equally across households, well, although low-income households spend a larger share of their income on energy, high-income households actually consume more income or more energy. So lower-income households would almost surely get more money back in terms of this refund than they would have paid in the carbon tax. And again, because the tax would be falling so heavily, if it wasn't for the refunds, on low-income families, that would be a strong argument that a lot of people would raise against a carbon tax.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess, on the flip side, though, thinking about that, obviously we impose a tax because we want to reduce certain behavior here, producing pollution. So if we're just providing rebates through this tax revenue, wouldn't that ultimately just cancel out the purpose and the effect of the tax?
You might think that, but it turns out that that's not necessarily going to happen. What would depend on is exactly how you're refunding the money. If you're refunding it exactly equal to the way that you're collecting it, then it's going to cancel things out. So if I know, like, okay, I'm going to pay $100 in carbon tax this year, but I know I'm going to get a $100 refund back at the end of the year, then other than having to wait for the time I don't have the money, it really doesn't have much effect on my spending. But I know that if I pay an extra $100 in carbon tax, well, that I'll get a refund, but that refund is going to be divided amongst over 100 million households in the country. So I will get like 1/100 of the amount of tax that I pay back, which is essentially zero. So the refund is going to be essentially separate from how much you're paying in the tax. So because of that, it's not going to just offset the incentives.
Okay. And so, based on this, it sounds like a carbon tax would be extremely beneficial. Might there be any reasons to be skeptical about imposing some sort of tax like that?
Well, I think there are some, and I think that this gets into some issues that both draw on some of the economics behind the modeling that is going on here, some of the climate and science, and then also some concerns from political economy or public choice.
Okay. And what I think one of those issues might be, obviously, if the U.S. were to implement some sort of a carbon tax, then that would be one country, right, out of the world. Would that really make much of a difference? So, might it be worthwhile to look into making a carbon tax conditional on other countries also imposing some sort of tax or reducing emissions?
Yeah, so this is one issue that I think President Trump raised when he made his announcement of pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, is saying that the U.S. participation in the Paris Climate Accord was going to have an infinitesimal effect on, reduce a tiny amount of warming, like on the order of the hundredths of a degree Celsius of warming that this would avoid. And in some sense, this is true, but it also reflects the fact that the climate change or global warming is a global problem. It truly is a global problem. Over the span of the next 100 years or so, we were projecting emissions of greenhouse gases. The U.S. emissions will amount to somewhere between about 7 and perhaps 23% of total global estimated emissions over this period of time, depending on exactly the formulas and everything. So, we're contributing perhaps about 10% of the emissions. So that means that even if we reduced all of our carbon emissions completely, we'd only contribute we'd only reduce 1/10 of the carbon emissions that are projected to occur over, say, the next 100 years. So, but I think that ultimately just means that this is a global problem. It's not one that we can solve ourselves.
So, along these lines, then there are also economists and scientists, and a number of other scientists have tried to estimate the costs associated with greenhouse gas emissions and pollutions, and obviously, those estimates vary across the board. So, based on that, is there any reason to possibly be skeptical of a carbon tax?
Quite possibly. The way we have talked about this, economists just calculating what they think the carbon tax would be. And so this is what we call an optimal carbon tax. And it's calculated based on using what is known as an integrated assessment model that would model the behavior of the economy, the behavior of the environment, and emissions being generated in the economy that go into the environment and back and forth. William Nordhaus, who shared the 2018 Nobel Prize in Economics, was a pioneer in putting together like the first integrated assessment model to bring all these different parts together to show how you would go about trying to get the answer to this question. And I think it was a tremendous advance in economics to just see, to show for everybody, like these are the different pieces of the puzzle we would need to have. These are the things we'd have put together, and this is how we go about making those calculations. Now, we know there's a couple of things in here where we have, where we're relying on things, and one is on the level of using climate models. So we're using climate models, and there's disagreement amongst some climate scientists about how much the temperatures are going to go up if, say, there's a doubling of atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide. Is what's called the equilibrium climate sensitivity. And there is some dispute over the last 25 years or so. IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, reports have been reducing a little bit their equilibrium climate sensitivity. We know that climate models over the last 25 years that the IPCC has been using have been predicting more warming than we've observed to date. And I mean, we're not quite sure, but as an economist, evaluating the climate models is sort of out of my area of specialties, expertise. And so, it's certainly concerning. There are some other elements, though, the integrated assessment models, I know we as economists know are a little more weak. And one of the things there is that even if the atmospheric temperature was to rise, like say 2 or 3 degrees centigrade, and you're trying to estimate, well, what would be the cost of that? The cost of that may not be as great as the models are showing. And that's because we might be able to do stuff to adjust or adapt to a warmer environment. And we know, amongst economists, I think there's a reasonable sense that these integrated assessment models are not modeling adaptation very well. In part because we don't know, you're looking at things in the past and trying to project a future that hasn't occurred yet, and is going to be possibly very different from the past.
Right.
So it's hard to know exactly what kind of actions could be taken to reduce impacts of climate change. I mean, we do know, for instance, we could build we could build seawalls, for instance, or relocate cities to higher ground to avoid some of the effects of climate change or rising sea levels. And so it's just not completely clear, and especially in agriculture and forestry, if we're measuring or measuring these effects of adaptation properly.
So based on that then, hypothetically suppose that the costs do end up being much lower than might be currently estimated or anything like that. Would that then negate the necessity for some sort of carbon tax?
I don't think they really would, because in effect what it would be saying is that the optimal carbon tax would be lower than we perhaps think it ought to be right now. So maybe instead of being $30 to start, maybe it should only be $10 to start. And there'd still be some advantages, especially over the long term, because we know that currently, to the extent that there is any costs from greenhouse gases, they're not being reflected within prices. And over the span of 100 or 200 years, I mean, we could see, if with absolutely nothing done to mitigate or reduce emissions, the atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide could rise, even if the effects aren't as serious as we thought they would be. They could still continue to rise over a long period of time. And so, maybe it just means, I think my reaction would be more a case of a lower carbon tax than we might guess otherwise, not no need to have a carbon tax at all.
So, another issue then too, obviously, is that any sort of change that does come about, or carbon tax that is imposed, would have to come through the political process. And obviously that's ripe with all sorts of issues itself. We saw that with, cap and trade, where, eventually it became, sort of derided as cap and tax, and that was one of the big reasons why it was killed. So I wonder, how might we be skeptical then of, the implementation of a carbon tax just based on the nature of politics?
Yes, and I think this is where I see there's a strong argument, or where I think that the economist's advice, recommendation here is weakest. And drawing here on the work of another Nobel Prize winner in economics, James Buchanan. Buchanan often criticizes or chided his colleagues in the area of public finance, economists working in the area of public finance, as saying that they were offering policy advice as if they were giving it to a benevolent despot and ignoring the political process. And that's really what we're doing with optimal carbon tax. Whereas economists are looking at, well, what would, if we got to choose what tax we think should be imposed, what tax would we want to impose? And then we're recommending to the political system that we make a change in the rules, a change in the institution to allow a new form of taxation, in the hopes that it's going to be used as we expect it, as we would like it to be used. But Buchanan wisely pointed out, realized that, look, the political process is going to determine what level of tax is going to be used, or how different instruments are going to be used. And Buchanan made this point particularly with regard to John Maynard Keynes' recommendations about running deficits for macroeconomic stabilization. Keynes argued that, there could be a role in the government running a budget deficit to help get us, say, out of the Great Depression, the Great Depression. But he didn't take into account the fact that politicians, once given the freedom to run deficits, would run deficits all the time. And so, yes, perhaps you could have used a budget deficit to stimulate the economy during the Great Depression, but the long-run effect of that is going to be the government could spend itself into bankruptcy. And with regard to this, most of the proponents, other than economists, of strong action against climate change are really looking more in terms of recommending that the world has to stop using fossil fuels over the span of about 30 years. Now, that may or may not be a good idea to undertake. But we certainly know that the optimal carbon tax isn't going to get us there, because, for instance, even when we get to a $100 a ton carbon tax, that's going to be increasing the price of gasoline by about perhaps $1 a gallon. And we know that just from estimates of how responsive people are to changes in prices of gasoline, that's not going to reduce the use of gasoline that much. It's going to reduce it, but not 100%. And so you have to have a carbon tax. If we're going to use a carbon tax to stop using fossil fuels, it's going to have to be probably an order of magnitude higher than what economists are recommending with our optimal carbon tax. And as I really in our same integrated assessment model showed that would be extremely costly. That the cost that would be generating net cost to our economy, and that the size of that cost would be about perhaps 5 times greater than the benefits we would capture from actually putting an optimal carbon tax into place. So we would really be facing some very large costs.
Well, thanks a lot, Dan. It was a great conversation.
Well, thanks for coming on and asking the questions, and thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.